Hello, Keller Williams Realty Leading Edge. This is Dave Nielsen, one of your productivity coaches. We're going to talk about the Rhode Island Mandatory Real Estate Relationship Disclosure. That's a mouthful. Rhode Island Mandatory Real Estate Relationship Disclosure. What's the most important word in there? Mandatory. This document is mandatory whenever you are speaking with somebody about, when you're serving in a real estate advisory capacity. Okay. What this document does is 2 pages. It essentially lines out you can see it right here, lines out the type of real estate relationships that exist. I'm going to go through them in a moment. And at the end, you check, this is all you actually have to fill out here, is that the consumer acknowledges that you serve them either as on the seller landlord side or the buyer tenant side, and then which of these forms or which of these capacities you serve them as a transaction facilitator or a designated client representative. The very important distinction here is a designated client representative. You are their representation. You serve them and only them. This comes with confidentiality. This comes with fiduciary responsibility. You are their servant. As a transaction facilitator, I don't want to reduce it to the idea that you are a paper pusher, but you are there to inform them of their obligations to complete a deal, and you are not serving as their representation. Therefore, you are not negotiating anything on their behalf, whereas a designated client representative, you would. So transaction facilitator. A transaction facilitator is a real estate licensee who provides assistance to a buyer, seller, tenant, or landlord, or both in a real estate transaction, but does not represent you, just like I just said, right? The duties that you owe to that customer, which notice we say not client, it says customer, to perform agreed upon ministerial acts timely and competently, to perform these acts with honesty, good faith, reasonable skill and care, and properly account for money or property placed in the care and responsibility of the principal broker. It is your job to ensure that the transaction goes forward, but to do so in a capacity where you are not representing that person or persons. Okay? Designated client representative. Designated client representative is a real estate licensee who represents a buyer, seller, tenant, or landlord in a real estate transaction and advocates on your behalf. This is the most common form of representation you will see. And as you are in the act of lead generating and acquiring clients, this is what you are going for. You are searching to be somebody's designated client representative. If I have a buyer, I am going out there and showing them properties, submitting offers on the behalf, negotiating those offers, negotiating with them through their inspection period, babysitting their transaction while it's in financing, and ensuring that it gets from the closing table from contract to the closing table. That's your job. You have a fiduciary responsibility to this person as their designated client representative. Okay. A neutral dual facilitator. Next one. Neutral dual facilitator is an individual real estate licensee who assists a buyer and seller or tenant and landlord in the same transaction and must be neutral as to any conflicting interests between the parties to the transaction. You're on both sides, but neither side really. Your job is to just inform each party, hey, Mr. Buyer or Mrs. Buyer, Mrs. Seller, Mr. Seller, these are your obligations. Great example is, okay, I don't represent the seller because I'm a neutral dual facilitator, but I do know that the seller needs to get a smoke certificate from the fire department of the town where the property is. You are obligated to inform them of that responsibility. Things like that. And that's if you're doing so on both sides. You can also be a transaction coordinator. A transaction coordinator is a principal broker or his or her designee who supervises. Is that how you say that? Designee, who supervises a real estate transaction. The principal broker or his or her designee, that word is going to haunt me forever, assumes this role in a transaction in which one affiliated licensee represents a buyer or tenant as a designated client representative, and another affiliated licensee represents a seller or landlord as a designated client representative in the same transaction, or if one of the affiliated licensees is assisting both the buyer and seller or landlord and tenant in the same transaction as a dual facilitator. What's a transaction coordinator really mean? Somebody who coordinates a transaction, and a lot of that responsibility is writing up paperwork, sending that paperwork out to get signed, scheduling certain things, but not actually representing anybody. You're coordinating the transaction. That's your role. Okay, and then this document lays out the licensee's responsibilities as a fiduciary. and then also provide some information on customer responsibilities. And then, here's the agreement down here that we referenced already. You mutually decide, if you are representing the seller landlord as a transaction facilitator or a designated client representative, or the buyer tenant as the same. Guys, if you do happen to find yourself on both sides of a transaction, which we definitely don't recommend, certainly not without consulting with your coach, both parties must sign this document with you. If you have a listing and a private buyer who's unrepresented comes in, you are going to have this document with your seller that says you are their designated client representative, but the buyer needs to understand that you are not their designated buyer client representative. You are their transaction facilitator. This is really important in the sense that if that buyer thinks that you're representing them, even though you know you're not, but that buyer thinks that you're representing them, and say they get as far as the closing table and the buyer and the seller are sitting at the same table and the purchase price is $500,000 and the seller says, I would have taken $470,000. That buyer looks at you and they think that you're the designated client representative. They say, well, hey, you didn't represent my interests like I thought you were doing. I'm really mad at you about this $30,000 and I can file suit against you. This document is meant to protect you in that situation. You can say, no, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we actually explained already how I serve you as a transaction facilitator and I am not meant to represent your interests. So if there is no agent on already representing that person, you're going to have that person sign the document. If you are in a situation where you're not sure if you need one, you do. But if you find yourself in a situation where you have questions about how to fill this out, how many to fill out, and how it should be filled out, please consult your coach. We're happy to help. Thank you.